Most people believe countries collapse because of wars, corruption, or bad leaders. But Sri Lanka collapsed for a quieter reason. A reason that looked harmless at first. A reason many developing nations are still repeating today. Sri Lanka didn't fall because it was poor. It fell because it borrowed money in the wrong way, from the wrong places, for the wrong reasons. And once that trap closed, there was no escape. Imagine waking up one morning and finding that your money is almost worthless. Fuel stations are empty, power cuts last for hours, food prices double in weeks. Hospitals begin running out of medicine, and the government admits it cannot pay its debts anymore. This wasn't a distant historical disaster. This happened recently. And it happened fast. Sri Lanka was once called a success story. Literacy rates were high, life expectancy was strong, tourism was booming, foreign investors were arriving. On the surface, everything looked stable, but underneath that stability was a growing dependence on debt. Not productive debt, not investment debt, consumption debt. For years, Sri Lanka borrowed heavily to fund highways, ports, airports, and grand infrastructure projects. These projects were meant to signal progress and attract global trade, but many of them failed to generate enough income to pay back the loans that built them. Debt kept piling up, and the government kept reassuring its people that everything was under control. Here is where the trap began to tighten. Instead of borrowing mostly from multilateral institutions with flexible terms, Sri Lanka increasingly turned to commercial loans and foreign bonds. These loans came with higher interest rates and strict repayment schedules. Unlike development loans, they didn't wait for economic growth. They demanded cash, on time, no excuses. At the same time, Sri Lanka's exports were not growing fast enough. The country imported more than it exported, which meant it constantly needed foreign currency. Tourism helped for a while, sending dollars into the economy. Remittances from overseas workers also played a role, but neither was enough to offset the growing debt obligations. Then came a series of shocks. First, the government made major tax cuts, reducing state revenue at exactly the wrong time. The intention was to stimulate growth, but the result was a massive hole in government finances. The state had less money to pay its bills, less money to service debt, and less money to protect its currency. Next, the pandemic hit. Tourism collapsed almost overnight. One of Sri Lanka's main sources of foreign currency disappeared. Remittances slowed, global trade froze, but debt payments didn't stop. Interest didn't pause. Deadlines didn't move. To survive, Sri Lanka began using its foreign reserves. Dollar by dollar, the safety net disappeared. The central bank tried to defend the local currency, selling reserves to keep it stable. But this only delayed the inevitable. Once reserves fell too low, confidence collapsed. This is the moment every debt-driven economy fears. When investors lose confidence, they stop lending. When lenders stop lending, refinancing becomes impossible. When refinancing fails, default becomes unavoidable. Sri Lanka was trapped. The government could no longer import fuel because it lacked dollars. Power plants shut down, transportation slowed, food distribution collapsed, inflation exploded. The local currency crashed, making imports even more expensive. A vicious cycle took over. People stood in fuel lines for days. Inflation wiped out savings. The middle class fell into poverty almost overnight. Public anger exploded into protests. Political stability vanished. Leadership changed, but the damage was already done. This is the true danger of debt traps. They don't explode immediately. They grow silently. They feel manageable. They are hidden behind growth statistics and shiny infrastructure. Until suddenly, they aren't manageable anymore. At this point, pause for a moment. If stories like this help you understand how nations quietly collapse, take a second to subscribe to Silent Collapse. This channel exists to explain the failures no one warns you about before they repeat again. What made Sri Lanka's situation even worse was timing. As global interest rates began rising, borrowing became more expensive. Investors moved money to safer markets. Risk-heavy economies were abandoned. Sri Lanka found itself isolated when it needed help the most. Eventually, the government announced what many already knew. It could not pay its debts. Sri Lanka defaulted. Default isn't just a financial word, it's a social shockwave. Credit ratings collapse, imports dry up, negotiations drag on for years. Recovery becomes slow and painful. Ordinary citizens pay the price long after the decision-makers are gone. The most dangerous part of this story is not that Sri Lanka borrowed money. Almost every country borrows. The danger was how that debt was structured, how it was used, and how long warning signs were ignored. Debt used for productivity can build an economy. Debt used for appearances destroys it. Sri Lanka's collapse wasn't sudden. It was gradual, predictable, and avoidable. But denial delayed action until there were no good options left. By the time reforms were forced, the damage was already irreversible. This is why economists call it a debt trap. Because once you rely on borrowing to survive instead of grow, every crisis pushes you deeper. Every shock becomes fatal. Every delay costs more than the last. Sri Lanka is now rebuilding, slowly, painfully, under strict conditions. But the lesson remains clear. Economic collapse doesn't always arrive with bombs or battles. Sometimes it arrives through spreadsheets, bond markets, and missed payments. And right now, many countries are walking dangerously close to the same edge. Silent collapses don't announce themselves. They happen quietly, until one day everyone feels them at once. If you want to understand how economies truly fail, not the stories taught in textbooks, but the ones unfolding in real time, stay here. Because collapse is rarely loud. It's silent. After the default, the real struggle didn't end. It began. International lenders stepped in, but help never comes without conditions. Subsidies were cut, taxes were raised, public spending was reduced. These measures were necessary to stabilize the economy, but for ordinary people, they felt like punishment for mistakes they never made. Prices stayed high. Jobs remained scarce. Trust in institutions was deeply broken. This is the hidden cost of a debt collapse. Recovery is not about months, it is about years. Sometimes decades. Young generations grow up paying for decisions made long before they had a voice. Sri Lanka's story is now studied as a warning, not of corruption alone, not of poor leadership alone, but of what happens when debt replaces discipline and optimism replaces planning. When short-term comfort is chosen over long-term survival, the most uncomfortable truth is this. Debt traps don't look like traps when you enter them. They look like opportunity. They look like growth. They look like progress. And by the time the danger becomes visible, turning back is no longer an option. This is why understanding silent collapses matters, because the next one will not announce itself either. What makes Sri Lanka's collapse even more dangerous as a lesson is how familiar it should feel. Nothing about it was extreme. There was no sudden revolution, no total war, no natural disaster large enough to explain the scale of the damage. It was a normal economy making normal decisions, one after another, until the margin for error disappeared. For years, warnings were visible. Debt to GDP kept rising. Foreign reserves kept shrinking. Imports kept growing faster than exports. But as long as daily life continued, those warnings were ignored. That is how collapses survive. Not through ignorance, but through postponement. Every time pressure increased, leaders chose delay instead of reform. Borrow more, roll over old loans, print more money, promise stability. Each decision bought time, but at a higher cost, and eventually, time ran out. Once confidence breaks, fixing numbers is no longer enough. You have to rebuild belief. Belief in currency, belief in leadership, belief that tomorrow will be better than today. That is far harder than balancing a budget. This is why economic collapse feels so personal. It reaches into kitchens, classrooms, and hospitals. It turns professionals into survivors. It rewrites futures without asking permission. Sri Lanka is often described as a warning for developing nations, but the real warning is broader. Any economy that confuses borrowing with growth and stability with safety is vulnerable. Debt does not destroy countries by itself. Dependence does. The most dangerous phase is not collapse. It is the period just before it, when everything still appears normal and warnings are dismissed as pessimism. That is where most nations fail, not because they cannot act, but because they choose not to. Sri Lanka's economy didn't end in a single moment. It faded, quietly, predictably, silently. And that is why these stories matter. because the next collapse will not look dramatic either. It will look manageable. Until it isn't. This is the pattern of silent collapse.